something is missing. Something has been happening, not in one place, not at one time, but everywhere, quietly, subtly, like a pattern forming just beneath the surface of reality. At first, no one noticed. The events were too small, too isolated to mean anything on their own. A security camera that failed at the exact wrong moment. An audio recording that dissolved into static just before an important detail was captured. A file that existed 1 second and was gone the next. Individually, they were dismissed. Technical errors, glitches, human mistakes. But then they started to connect. Across different cities, different countries, different people who had never met. There were reports of the same thing. Moments that resisted being recorded. Not just lost, but erased, as if they had never been allowed to exist in the first place. Photographs would blur in only one specific area of the frame. Video footage would distort, but only for a few seconds. Names and documents would vanish without altering the rest of the text. It wasn't random, it was selective. And that's what made it disturbing. Because whatever was causing it seemed to be choosing what not to be seen. The first real alarm came when a series of unrelated incidents were reviewed side by side. A building collapse with no clear cause. A public disturbance that ended in total confusion. A missing persons case where the last known location had no usable footage despite being covered by multiple cameras. In every case, there was a gap. A moment where something should have been there, but wasn't. Investigators tried to reconstruct timelines, but they kept running into the same problem. The closer they got to the center of each event, the less information remained. It was as if the truth itself was being stripped away, layer by layer, leaving behind only fragments. And in those fragments, a detail began to emerge. Witnesses, those few who claimed to remember clearly, started describing something unusual. Not an object, not an event, a person, a man. No one could agree on his face, or his voice, or even his age, but they all agreed on one thing. He was there, not doing anything, not speaking, not interacting, just standing somewhere nearby, watching. At first, it sounded like coincidence, the human brain searching for patterns where none existed. But the more accounts that surfaced, the harder it became to ignore. Because even though the descriptions varied, the presence did not. He appeared before things went wrong, before the footage failed, before the data corrupted, before reality itself seemed to hesitate. And then, just as suddenly as the anomalies began, he was gone. No records, no identity, no trace that he had ever existed, except for one thing, the absence he left behind. The investigation begins. The first person to take the pattern seriously was not a scientist, or a technician, or even a government agency. It was a journalist. He had built his career on stories that others avoided, cases that didn't quite make sense, incidents that were quietly buried, details that didn't fit the official narrative. He wasn't known for believing in the supernatural. In fact, he had spent years disproving it. But this was different, because this wasn't about belief. It was about absence. The story came to him the way most of his stories did, fragmented, incomplete, easy to ignore. A report about corrupted surveillance footage tied to a minor accident. A follow-up about missing audio logs in a police archive. A brief mention of a data failure during a public incident that should have been fully documented. On their own, they meant nothing, but together, they formed a pattern. At first, he assumed it was a technical issue, outdated systems, poor data management, human error on a larger scale. It made sense, it was logical. So he started there. He requested access to footage. He filed inquiries. He tracked down engineers, technicians, archivists, anyone who might explain why so many unrelated recordings were failing in such specific ways. The answers were always the same. We don't know. It shouldn't happen like that. There's no reason for the system to fail at that exact moment. That last part stayed with him. The exact moment. Because the failures weren't random. They didn't happen at the beginning of recordings or at the end. They happened precisely when something important was about to be captured, as if the system knew. That's when his approach changed. He stopped looking at the technology and started looking at the events themselves. He mapped them out, dates, locations, timelines, cross-referencing every incident he could find that involved unexplained data loss. The board in his apartment slowly filled with notes, photographs, printed reports, connected by lines that grew more complex by the day. At first, there was nothing, just chaos. But then slowly, something began to align. Certain events overlapped in ways that shouldn't have been possible. A camera failure in one city occurring at the exact same second as an audio distortion in another. A missing file timestamp that matched a power fluctuation thousands of miles away. It didn't make sense until he zoomed in closer, not on the events, on the moments just before them. That's where he found it. A detail so small, so easy to overlook that it had been ignored in every report. In the background of a witness statement, at the edge of a blurry photograph, mentioned casually in an interview transcript. A man. At first, it seemed insignificant. People appear in the background of events all the time. It meant nothing. But then he found it again, and again, and again. Different places, different times, different witnesses. The descriptions never matched exactly. Some said he was tall, others said average height, some remembered dark clothing, others couldn't recall what he wore at all. But they all agreed on one thing: he was there before it happened, not during, not after, before, always before. The journalist began isolating these accounts, pulling them out from the larger reports and placing them side by side. And the more he read, the more unsettling the pattern became. No one interacted with the man. No one approached him. In many cases, people didn't even realize they had seen him until they were asked directly. Until someone pointed out the gap, the missing moment, the thing that couldn't be explained. And then suddenly, they remembered. He was just standing there. I didn't think it was important. I thought he was part of the crowd. But there was something else, something that didn't fit. In every case where the man was mentioned, the data failed shortly after, not before, not randomly, after he appeared. That was the moment the journalist stopped thinking of it as coincidence. Because coincidences don't repeat with precision, patterns do. And this pattern had a center, a presence that couldn't be recorded, a figure that existed only in memory, a man with no name, no identity, no proof, except for the fact that he kept showing up right before reality broke. The untraceable presence. At first, the journalist believed the problem was technological. It had to be. There were too many variables, too many systems involved for anything else to make sense. Surveillance networks, personal devices, archival databases, each one built differently, maintained by different people, operating under entirely separate conditions. The idea that they could all fail in the same precise way, at the same precise moment, seemed impossible, unless there was a common flaw. So he searched for it. He started with the footage. Hours turned into days as he reviewed corrupted video files frame by frame, slowing them down, enhancing what little remained. Most of it was unusable. Distorted images, smeared colors, digital noise that swallowed entire sections of time. But he wasn't looking for clarity anymore. He was looking for consistency, and he found it. The distortions weren't random. They followed a pattern. Every time an anomaly occurred, the interference behaved in nearly identical ways. The image would lose focus, but not uniformly. It would blur around a specific region, as if something in the frame resisted being captured. Compression artifacts would spike unnaturally, forming jagged shapes that flickered in and out of existence. Frames would drop, but only during a narrow window of time. Seconds, always seconds. As if the recording itself was being interrupted, he moved on to audio. The results were no better, just different. Where video blurred, audio warped. Voices stretched into unnatural tones. Frequencies spiked beyond normal human range. In several recordings, there were brief moments, fractions of a second, where something else could be heard beneath the distortion. Not words, not exactly, but structured, deliberate, like something trying to pass through the noise and almost succeeding. He isolated those fragments, replaying them over and over, filtering frequencies, stripping away layers of interference. But every time he got close, every time it felt like something was about to become clear, the data collapsed. Files corrupted mid-analysis. Software crashed without error messages. Entire segments vanished from storage. It wasn't just the recordings anymore. It was anything that tried to examine them. That was the moment the unease set in. Because systems fail. but they don't defend themselves. And this felt like resistance. Still, he kept going. If digital records couldn't be trusted, he would rely on physical ones, printed reports, handwritten notes, analog storage that couldn't simply delete itself without a trace. Or so he thought. At first, it worked. Documents remained intact, notes stayed where he left them. For a brief moment, it felt like he had found a way around whatever was happening, until he looked closer. Words were missing. Not entire sentences, just parts, names, descriptions, specific details that should have been there, but weren't. Ink that had faded unevenly, leaving behind gaps that made the text feel incomplete. He checked older copies. They matched. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just affecting new data. It was reaching backward, altering records that already existed, rewriting the past in small, precise ways. The journalist began to understand something then, something that made the situation far worse than he had imagined. This wasn't a failure of technology. It wasn't even a failure of documentation. It was a failure of observation, or more accurately, a refusal. Because every attempt to capture the man ended the same way. The closer he got to being recorded, the more unstable the data became. Cameras didn't just lose focus, they struggled, as if trying to resolve something they weren't allowed to see. Audio didn't just distort, it fractured, as if the sound itself couldn't hold together in his presence. And when the interference passed, there was nothing left. No silhouette, no outline, no evidence that anyone had ever been there, except for memory. But memory was unreliable. The journalist knew that. It could be influenced, altered, shaped by suggestion. That's why he had trusted recordings in the first place, because they didn't forget. But now, recordings were forgetting. And that changed everything. He began conducting controlled tests, simple setups, static cameras, continuous recording in empty environments. He documented everything: timestamps, environmental conditions, system performance, looking for any sign of spontaneous failure. For days, nothing happened. The footage remained stable, the audio clean, the data intact, until he introduced one variable: testimonies. He invited individuals who claimed to have seen the man, asked them to describe what they remembered while being recorded. He kept the setup simple, controlled, repeatable, and that's when it happened again. The moment they began describing him, the systems failed. Not gradually, instantly. Cameras blurred, audio collapsed into distortion. Storage devices returned errors that shouldn't exist under normal conditions. In one case, the entire recording system shut down without losing power, as if it had simply stopped. But the most disturbing part wasn't the failure, it was the timing. It didn't happen when they mentioned events or locations or other people, only when they described him, as if even the act of remembering was too close to recording. That was when the journalist stopped asking how this was happening and started asking why. Because whatever this presence was, it wasn't just untraceable. It was actively avoiding being traced, not hiding, not escaping, but preventing itself from ever being captured in the first place. And the more he investigated, the clearer it became. This wasn't a glitch, it was intentional. A presence that could not be recorded, a figure that erased itself from reality's memory, not by disappearing, but by ensuring it had never been seen at all. The witness. The journalist didn't believe in witnesses, not completely. In his experience, memory was fragile, easily shaped, easily broken. People didn't lie on purpose most of the time. They simply remembered things the way their minds needed them to be remembered. Details blurred, timelines shifted, faces changed. That's why he trusted evidence. Except now, evidence couldn't be trusted, which left him with only one option. He had to listen. The witness was not easy to find. Their name had appeared only once, buried deep inside a transcript from a minor incident that had never made headlines. No follow-up, no official statement, just a brief note that read, "Subject reported unusual presence prior to event." That was enough. It took weeks to track them down. The address on record was outdated, the contact number disconnected. It felt at times like the person himself was slipping away from documentation, just like everything else connected to the case. But eventually he found him. A small apartment, quiet neighborhood, nothing remarkable. The kind of place where nothing strange should ever happen. The man who opened the door looked ordinary, middle-aged, tired, the kind of face you wouldn't remember after looking away. And for a brief moment, the journalist wondered if this had all been a mistake, until the man spoke. "You're here about him." Not a question, a statement. The journalist didn't answer immediately. He studied the man instead, his posture, his eyes, the subtle tension in the way he held the door, like he had been expecting this moment for a long time. "Can I come in?" the journalist asked. A pause. Then the man stepped aside. The apartment was dim, curtains drawn tight despite the daylight outside. The air felt still, heavy, as if the space hadn't been properly aired in days or longer. They sat across from each other. No recording devices, no cameras, just a notebook. The journalist hesitated for the first time since the investigation began, not because he doubted the witness, but because something about this felt different, more fragile. "If you're going to write this down," the man said quietly, "don't write everything." The journalist frowned. "Why?" Another pause. "Because some of it doesn't stay." That was enough to unsettle him. Still, he nodded. "Tell me what you remember." The man leaned back slightly, eyes unfocused, not looking at the journalist, but somewhere past him, as if replaying something he wasn't sure he wanted to see again. "It wasn't the event that I remember," he said slowly. "That's the strange part." "Then what do you remember?" "The moment before." Silence filled the room. The journalist waited. "I was in a cafe," the man continued. "Nothing unusual. People talking, music playing, just normal." His voice wavered slightly. "And then I noticed him." The journalist didn't interrupt. He wasn't doing anything. That's what made it so easy to ignore at first. He was just standing near the back wall, not sitting, not ordering anything, just there. "Did anyone else see him?" the journalist asked. "I don't know," the man replied. "That's the problem. I didn't think to check. He didn't stand out, not really. If you looked at him directly, there was nothing unusual. But you noticed him." "Yes." "Why?" The man hesitated. "I don't know." It wasn't the answer the journalist expected. "I just did," the man continued, "for no reason, like something in my head decided to pay attention even though there was nothing to see." The journalist wrote that down. "And then?" he asked. The man's hands tightened slightly, and then everything changed. The journalist leaned forward. "How?" "I don't remember." That made him stop. "You don't remember the event?" The man shook his head. "No, that's the thing. Everyone talks about what happened, the panic, the confusion, the way everything just broke." His voice dropped lower. "But I don't remember any of that." "What do you remember?" The man looked up, directly at the journalist. "I remember him." A long silence followed. "He didn't move," the man said. "Not at first. He just stood there. And I kept thinking, I should look away. I should focus on something else." "But you didn't." "No." "Why not?" The man swallowed. "Because it felt like if I looked away, I wouldn't be able to find him again." The journalist felt a chill run through him. "And then?" he asked quietly. The man's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "And then he looked at me. The room seemed smaller somehow." "Are you sure?" the journalist asked. "Yes." "What did he do?" "Nothing." "What do you mean?" "He just looked at me." The journalist frowned. "That's all?" The man shook his head slowly. "No, not exactly." "Then what?" Another pause, longer this time, as if the man was deciding whether or not to continue. "When he looked at me," he said finally, "it didn't feel like he was seeing me." The journalist's pen stopped moving. What did it feel like? The man's eyes didn't leave his. It felt like he was recognizing me. Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. "And then what happened?" the journalist asked. The man leaned back, exhaling slowly. "That's when everything else disappeared." "Disappeared?" "Yes. The people, the sound, the room. It all just stopped mattering." The journalist's voice tightened. "And him?" "He was still there." "Doing what?" The man hesitated one last time, then said, "Waiting." The word lingered in the air. "For what?" the journalist asked. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly past the journalist's shoulder, and for the first time since the conversation began, he looked afraid. "I think," he said slowly, "he wasn't waiting for the event." The journalist felt his pulse quicken. Then what was he waiting for? The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "For me to notice him." The VHS tape. By the time the journalist found the tape, he had already stopped expecting answers. Every lid he had followed up to that point ended the same way. Corrupted data, incomplete records, witnesses who remembered just enough to be unsettling, but never enough to be useful. The closer he got to understanding the pattern, the less stable the evidence became. So when the tape surfaced, he didn't trust it. He couldn't. It appeared in the inventory of a small, nearly abandoned archive facility, one of hundreds of forgotten collections that had never been fully digitized. Boxes of analog media, stacked and mislabeled, gathering dust in rooms that hadn't been properly cataloged in decades. It shouldn't have stood out, but it did. There was no record of who submitted it, no classification, no accompanying notes, just a single label, handwritten in fading ink, "Do not erase." That alone was enough to draw his attention, because nothing else in that archive had a warning. He signed it out under routine access, trying not to attract attention, not because he thought anyone was watching, but because at this point he had learned to be careful about anything connected to the case. The tape felt ordinary, lightweight, worn but intact, no visible damage, no indication that it contained anything unusual. And yet, as he held it, there was a quiet sense of resistance, something subtle, almost psychological, like the feeling of standing too close to the edge of something you don't fully understand. He ignored it. Back in his apartment, he set up an old VHS player he had acquired specifically for situations like this. Analog systems had become his only reliable option. They couldn't delete themselves. They couldn't corrupt remotely. At least, that's what he wanted to believe. He inserted the tape. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered to life, static. A low hum filled the room, the familiar distortion of magnetic playback echoing through the speakers. The image struggled to stabilize, horizontal lines tearing across the frame before slowly settling into something coherent. A timestamp appeared in the corner, 20 years ago. The footage was simple, a small room, poorly lit. A group of people gathered casually, talking, laughing, moving in and out of frame. It looked like a home video, nothing staged, nothing significant. The journalist leaned closer. This was normal, too normal. He watched carefully, scanning every corner of the frame, every movement, every shadow. He had trained himself to notice what others ignored, to find patterns where none should exist. At first there was nothing, just people, just noise, just time passing. Minutes went by. He almost stopped the tape, and then he saw him. Not because the image changed, but because his attention did. In the far corner of the room, partially obscured by shadow, there was a man, standing still, not interacting, not speaking, not even shifting his weight. Just there. The journalist frowned. How had he missed that? He rewound the tape slightly, watched again. There he was, unmoving, unnoticed. None of the people in the room acknowledged him. They walked past him, turned their backs to him, spoke over him as if he wasn't occupying the same space. It wasn't just that he was being ignored. It was as if he didn't belong to the scene at all. The journalist felt a tightening in his chest. This was it. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a corrupted fragment or a distorted trace. He was seeing the man, clearly, and nothing was failing. No blurring, no interference, no missing data. Just a man, standing in a room. He leaned even closer to the screen, studying details. The man's posture was relaxed but deliberate. His clothing was plain, dark, indistinct, offering no identifying features. His face, that was harder to focus on. Not blurred, not exactly, but difficult to remember the moment he looked away. The journalist blinked, trying to hold on to the image. It slipped, like trying to recall a dream seconds after waking up. Still, he kept watching. The footage continued normally. Conversations overlapped. Someone moved in front of the camera, blocking part of the frame. Laughter rose and fell. And in the background, the man remained, unchanging, constant. Time seemed to move around him rather than with him. Then, as the tape approached its end, something shifted. Not in the room, in the atmosphere. The journalist felt it before he saw it, a subtle tension, a quiet distortion, not in the image, but in the feeling of watching it. The people in the footage continued as before, unaware, but the man moved. It was small, barely noticeable, a slight adjustment of his head, a change in angle. But it was enough, because now he was no longer looking into the room. He was looking forward. The journalist froze, his breath slowed. There was no camera movement, no zoom, no reason for the man's attention to shift. And yet, he was looking directly ahead, directly at the frame. The air in the apartment felt heavier. The low hum of the VHS player grew louder, or maybe it just felt that way. Seconds stretched. The footage began to degrade slightly near the end, faint flickers of static creeping into the corners of the screen. And then, the man spoke. One word, clear, undistorted. Finally, the tape cut to static. Silence filled the room. The journalist didn't move. His mind raced, trying to process what he had just seen. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it made sense. He rewound the tape immediately, watched again, same result, same moment, same word. But something felt off. Not the footage, the perspective. He paused the frame just before the man spoke, zoomed in as much as the analog signal would allow, studied the angle of his gaze, the alignment of his eyes, the direction of his head. And that's when the realization hit. Slow, cold, unavoidable. The man wasn't looking at the camera. He couldn't be. The angle didn't match. The camera was positioned slightly off-center, low, angled upward toward the group. But the man's gaze was straight ahead, precise, fixed on a point that didn't exist within the recorded space. The journalist leaned back slowly, heart pounding, because there was only one explanation left. The man in the tape wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at something beyond it, something outside the frame, something that shouldn't have been visible to him. The journalist glanced at the blank reflection of the screen, and for the first time since the investigation began, he felt like he wasn't the one watching anymore. The moment. The journalist didn't sleep after watching the tape. He told himself it was because he needed to analyze it further, to review every frame, every second, every detail that might have been overlooked. But the truth was simpler than that. He didn't trust what would happen if he stopped watching. The VHS player remained on. The faint hum of the machine filled the apartment, looping the same recording again and again. Each time the tape reached the end, he rewound it. Each time it restarted, he focused harder, as if repetition alone might reveal something new. But the footage never changed. The room, the people, the noise, and in the corner, the man, always there, always still. At first, the journalist treated it like evidence, something to be studied, dissected, understood. He took notes, marked timestamps, sketched rough diagrams of the room's layout, calculating sightlines, angles, distances. He tried to be rational, but something about the moment, the exact moment when the man moved, refused to stay rational, because it didn't behave like a normal action. It didn't feel like someone turning their head. It felt deliberate, as if the movement wasn't part of the recording, but a response to it. By the fifth time he watched the tape, the journalist noticed something new. Not in the image, in himself. He knew when it was about to happen, not because he remembered the timestamp, not because he was paying attention, but because something inside him anticipated it. A quiet tension built in his chest seconds before the man moved. His breathing slowed without him realizing. His focus narrowed, locking onto the corner of the screen, waiting for the moment. He paused the tape just before it happened. Silence. The frozen image stared back at him. The man stood in the corner, unchanged, unremarkable, just another figure in a room that no one noticed. The journalist leaned forward, studying, searching for anything that might explain what he was feeling. There was nothing. He pressed play. The tape continued, and then it happened. The movement, small, precise. The man's head shifted slightly, as if aligning with something that had just entered his awareness. The journalist felt it again. That tension, that pull, stronger this time, like something inside him was being acknowledged. He froze. Not the tape, himself. Because in that moment, it didn't feel like he was watching a recording anymore. It felt like the recording was reacting to him. The man's gaze lifted, slowly, deliberately, until it was no longer directed at the room, but forward, direct, unbroken. The journalist's hand tightened around the edge of the table. His pulse echoed in his ears. And then came the realization. Not sudden, not sharp, but creeping, like a thought that had always been there, waiting to be understood. The timing didn't make sense. The angle didn't make sense. Nothing about the moment aligned with reality as it should exist. Because the man wasn't just turning toward the camera, he was turning toward something else, something beyond it, something outside the recording. The journalist replayed the moment again and again. Each time, the feeling grew stronger, more personal, more specific, until he couldn't ignore it anymore. He wasn't just observing the moment, he was part of it. The idea should have been impossible. The tape was 20 years old, fixed, unchanging, a record of something that had already happened, locked in time, immune to influence. And yet, the man's movement felt reactive, intentional, as if it depended on being seen. The journalist paused the tape again. This time, his hand trembled slightly. He stared at the frozen frame, at the man, at the eyes that seemed to be looking past everything within the recorded space. And for the first time, he asked the question he had been avoiding. What if the moment wasn't complete on its own? What if it required something else? Something outside the tape? Something watching it? A cold realization settled in. The moment only existed fully when someone observed it, his breath caught, because that meant the man's movement wasn't just part of the recording, it was part of an interaction, across time, across something deeper than time. The journalist felt the room around him shift, not physically, but perceptually. The walls seemed further away, the silence heavier, the faint hum of the VHS player louder than it should have been. He pressed play again, but this time he didn't look at the whole screen. He focused only on the man, waiting, watching. The seconds passed, the tension built, and then the man moved. But this time it felt different. Not because the action had changed, but because the journalist had. He understood it now, or at least he understood enough. The man wasn't just appearing before events. He wasn't just present before things went wrong. He was waiting for something, for someone. The gaze locked forward, unmistakable, unavoidable, and in that instant, the journalist felt it completely. Not fear, not confusion, recognition, as if the distance between the recording and reality had collapsed into a single point, as if the man in the tape had finally found what he was looking for. The journalist didn't realize he had leaned closer until the screen filled his vision, until the room around him disappeared into the background, until there was nothing left except the moment and the man within it, waiting, watching for him. The discovery. The journalist stopped thinking of the tape as evidence, because evidence was supposed to be stable, objective, unchanging. And this wasn't. At some point, he couldn't say exactly when, the act of watching the tape had shifted from analysis to participation. The more he replayed it, the less it felt like a recording of the past, and the more it felt like something happening now. Not in the room, but through it. He tried to ground himself in logic. The tape was 20 years old. The events had already happened. Nothing inside it could change. And yet, something about his perception of it was changing. He began documenting his observations more carefully, forcing himself back into method. If there was a pattern, he would find it. If there was a flaw in his thinking, he would expose it. He started with the basics: frame position, camera angle, line of sight. He sketched the room again, this time in greater detail. He marked where the camera was placed, low, slightly off-center, angled upward toward the group. Then he mapped the position of the man in the corner. From a purely physical perspective, it didn't make sense. If the man were looking at the camera, his gaze should have been slightly downward, aligned with the lens's position. But it wasn't. It was straight, level, fixed on a point that did not exist within the geometry of the room. The journalist circled that point on his sketch, an empty space. He stared at it for a long time, because that was the first real inconsistency he could prove. Not a distortion, not a missing frame, but something wrong. He went further, measured the angle of the man's head relative to his shoulders, compared it across multiple playbacks, paused the tape at the exact frame before the movement, then immediately after. There was no gradual transition, no natural motion blur. It was as if the man's position had updated. One frame he was looking slightly off to the side. The next, he wasn't. The journalist felt a growing unease, not because the detail itself was impossible, but because of what it implied. Motion should take time. Even the smallest movement exists across multiple frames. But this didn't. It behaved like a cut, except nothing else in the scene had changed. The room was continuous. The people were continuous. Only the man wasn't. He rewound again, watched slower, frame by frame, and then he saw something he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't in the man. It was in everything else. For a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, The rest of the footage seemed to lag, not freeze, not distort, but hesitate, as if reality itself needed a moment to adjust. And then the man moved. The journalist leaned back, heart pounding, because that meant the movement wasn't happening within the recording. The recording was adjusting around the movement. That was the moment the final piece fell into place. Slowly, inevitably, he turned his attention away from the screen, not completely, just enough to catch the reflection of it in the dark surface of the window beside him. The image was faint, distorted, but still visible. The room from the tape, the people, the man, and layered over it, his own reflection. Sitting there, watching. The journalist's breath caught. He looked back at the screen, then at the reflection, then back again. And for a brief, disorienting instant, the two didn't align. The angle was wrong, subtly, but undeniably, because if the man in the tape was looking at the camera, then his gaze should meet the center of the screen. But it didn't. It met something else, something slightly offset, something closer. The journalist slowly turned his head, not toward the screen, but toward where the man's gaze would extend beyond the camera, beyond the recorded space, into the room, into his space. His pulse thundered in his ears, because now there was no way to deny it. The man in the tape was not looking at the camera. He was looking at the observer, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. The tape was not a closed system. It was not a fixed recording. It was incomplete, and the missing component was whoever was watching it. The journalist felt a cold weight settle over him, because that meant the moment didn't fully exist until he played it, until he observed it, until he became part of it. He turned back to the screen one last time. The tape was still running. The moment had already passed. The man had already spoken. Finally, the word echoed in his mind, different now. Not just a line from a recording, but a response, a conclusion, as if something had been waiting, not for the event in the tape, not for the people in the room, but for him, for someone, anyone, to reach this point, to understand, to see. The journalist stared at the screen, unable to look away, and for the first time since this began, he realized something far worse than not being able to record the man. He realized the man didn't need to be recorded because he could be observed, and observation was enough. He was never looking at the camera. It took the journalist longer than he wanted to admit to accept it, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because once he did, there would be no going back. For days, he had tried to prove himself wrong. He adjusted brightness, contrast, perspective. He reanalyzed the geometry of the room, recalculated angles, reconstructed the environment in sketches and models, searching for any explanation that would return the moment to something normal, something contained. But every attempt led to the same conclusion. The man's gaze did not align with the camera. It never had. At first, it seemed like a minor discrepancy, something that could be explained by distortion, by lens warping, by the imperfections of analog recording. But the more precise his measurements became, the more impossible those explanations felt. Because the error wasn't random, it was exact, consistent across every playback, every pause, every frame. The man wasn't looking slightly off. He was looking somewhere specific, somewhere that existed outside the recorded space. The journalist stopped the tape at the exact frame, the moment where the man's eyes locked forward, just before he spoke. He leaned closer to the screen, studying it not as footage, but as a point of contact, because that's what it had become, a boundary between what was recorded and what wasn't. He traced the line of sight again, this time not within the room, but beyond it, extending it outward, past the camera's position, past the physical limits of the scene, into a space that should have been empty, but wasn't. Because now, he knew where that line ended. It ended with him. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with clarity, cold, precise, unavoidable. The man in the tape had never acknowledged the people in the room, never interacted with the environment, never reacted to anything happening within the recorded moment, because none of it mattered. It was never the point. The room was incidental. The people were irrelevant. The event itself, whatever it had been, was secondary. All of it existed only as a setting, a stage, for a single moment, the moment when someone sometime in the future would watch. The journalist's breathing slowed, because now the sequence made sense. The man appears before anomalies. Data fails when he is near. Recordings distort when he is about to be captured. Not because he cannot be recorded, but because recording was never the mechanism. Observation was, and recordings are meant to be observed. The journalist felt a subtle shift in his understanding, like a piece of the world quietly rearranging itself into a more disturbing shape. Every corrupted file, every blurred image, every missing second of footage. They weren't failures, they were corrections. Adjustments to ensure that the man could never be fully contained within a recording, never reduced to something passive, something fixed, something that could exist without interaction, because he didn't exist in recordings. He existed at the moment of observation, at the point where someone looks and something looks back. The journalist stared at the frozen frame again, at the man's eyes, unblinking, focused. Not on the past, not on the scene, but forward, outward, through the screen, and into the present, into him. The weight of it settled slowly, because that meant the man had never been part of the tape in the way he thought. He hadn't been recorded. He had been waiting for the moment when someone would press play, waiting for the exact point in time when the past and present would overlap, when the illusion of distance would collapse into a single shared instant. The journalist's reflection faintly overlapped the image on the screen. Two layers, two realities, one moment, and at the center of it, the man, still, unmoving, watching, not as something trapped in the past, but as something reaching into the present. The journalist finally understood the meaning of that single word. Finally. Not relief, not completion, recognition, as if the man had been aware across all that time that this moment would come, that someone would arrive here, that someone would see. Because he was never looking at the camera, he was looking at whoever was watching, and now, that was him. What comes next? The journalist didn't turn off the tape. He couldn't. Not because he was afraid of what might happen if he did, but because something in him understood that the moment hadn't ended. It had only completed. The screen had long since returned to static. The faint hiss of analog noise filled the apartment, steady and indifferent, as if nothing unusual had occurred. If someone else had walked in at that moment, they would have seen nothing more than an old television playing empty signal. But the journalist knew better, because something had changed, not in the tape, in him. He sat there for a long time, unmoving, eyes fixed on the flickering static, as if expecting the image to return. Part of him wanted it to, wanted confirmation that what he had seen was real, contained, repeatable. But another part of him, quieter, deeper, understood that repetition was no longer necessary. He had already been seen. That was enough. The thought didn't arrive as fear. It arrived as certainty. Everything he had uncovered, the missing data, the corrupted footage, the witness accounts, the pattern of appearances, it all pointed in one direction, not toward an explanation, but toward a process, a sequence. The man appears, something happens, the evidence fails, and then someone notices. The journalist exhaled slowly, because now, for the first time, he could see where he was in that sequence. Not at the beginning, not outside it, but inside, at the point where observation becomes involvement. He stood up from his chair, the movement feeling distant, disconnected, like he was watching himself from somewhere slightly removed. The room around him felt unchanged, yet subtly unfamiliar, as if the act of understanding had altered the way it existed. He glanced at the dark reflection of the television screen. For a brief moment, he hesitated, not because he expected to see something behind him, but because he wasn't sure he wouldn't. The silence pressed in, heavy, waiting. He looked anyway, just his reflection, just the room, just the same space he had been in for hours, and yet it didn't feel empty. The journalist turned away, walked slowly toward his desk where his notes were scattered, pages filled with observations, connections, theories that now felt incomplete. Not wrong, just insufficient, because none of them had accounted for this, for the part where the observer becomes part of the system. He picked up his notebook, flipped through the pages. Every detail he had written suddenly felt like it belonged to an earlier version of the investigation, a version where he believed distance still existed between him and what he was studying. That distance was gone. He understood that now. The man didn't need to be recorded. He didn't need to be tracked or identified or explained. He only needed to be noticed. And once that happened, the process continued. The journalist closed the notebook slowly. His mind returned to the witness's words. He just shows up before it happens. A quiet realization followed. If that was true, then something was going to happen. Something that hadn't yet. Something that came after this moment. After the tape. After the recognition. He felt a subtle shift in the air again. Not physical, but perceptual. The same quiet tension he had felt while watching the tape began to return, building slowly, almost imperceptibly. A familiar feeling. Anticipation. The journalist stood still, listening to the silence, waiting without meaning to, because now he understood something he hadn't before. The man never caused anything. He never interfered. He never acted. He only appeared before, and that meant whatever came next was already on its way.
Shadows